Hi, my name is Tiffany. I was born here in Ohio, and my parents were both very young. Very early on, my dad was abusive physically to my mom, and they brought me into the world very quickly after they got married. Didn't have much, and so it was a very difficult situation. Sometime around 3 years old, there was sexual abuse from my father, and it became very intense, where by the time I was 5, I had already lost my virginity. And so from very young, I developed all kinds of trust issues. I lived in fear at home, trying to keep secrets, under manipulation from my father. I had a younger sister that I was scared and wanted to protect. So this is just a big part of what developed the way that I process things through life and just trying to be very strong. About 8 years old is my mom actually found out about the sexual abuse, and she was being physically abused by my dad. But at that time, when she found out about the abuse, we decided to move to Texas, or she did. It was a slow process because we were very scared of my father, and we just started moving, actually mailing things back to my mom's family in Texas. And it took, probably about 6 months. So another 6 months of abuse, but I knew we were going to leave. And so that was encouraging. Once we got to Texas, my mom turned to alcoholism, and her family it's ridden with alcoholism, very abusive men. They're Hispanic. And so I developed a whole mind frame about what that was like and the culture. And it just added on to insecurities and lack of trust for men. My mom struggled being on her own and soon moved in with her high school sweetheart that she had before my dad. At that time, she wasn't aware, but he had a addiction to crack cocaine. And it was a whirlwind of adult parties. I was still very young, about 10. And it was, staying in homes where we shouldn't have been. I had learned to guard myself at that age and not put myself in situations because there was no adults to watch us. So I kind of was the caregiver, and that was very difficult, but I was aware of, predators and stuff at that time. So I had built up like a defense wall at that point. So going through years of being around alcoholism and drug abuse, I finally hit my teenage years. And at the age of 15, I really went wild. That's where I had, I guess, willingly, what I would say, lost my virginity to the first guy that would pay attention to me, and ran away. I started running away from home and turned to drugs myself. So over the course of a whole weekend or a summer, I tried every drug that you could think of and really got hooked. So I went in and out of rehab a couple of times, but I was a constant runaway. I ended up moving out at the age of 15, about to be 16. I moved in with a guy I had just met and his family, and they were messed up too. But I moved in with them, and I finally trusted a guy. So the guy that I was with, it was, what I would have thought a healthy relationship for back then. But I knew in my mind that I didn't want what I grew up with, the drug abuse and partying and all of that. And so my goal was I wanted to get married. I wanted to have children. I wanted a healthy family. And so I thought that I was going to have this. This is at age 16. I thought I was going to marry this guy. We had stayed together for quite a while. We moved out and get our own apartment. And then when we turned 19, we moved into a new apartment, and I had the perfect job. I was working for an attorney. We were happy, got a new car, all these things. Everything seemed so perfect. And I ended up being diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so I went through chemo and radiation, and that was very difficult. My boyfriend at the time, Derek, he actually wanted to get married. It was almost seemed like movie quality kind of thing. It was out of fear that I was going to die and stuff. But we didn't. But he stuck it through, but he ended up struggling from just the stress of everything. He fell back into drug use. So that was heartbreaking for me. I would have done anything to keep him because, of course, I had all of these insecurities from early on that I wanted a healthy relationship with a man and I thought I could trust him. And so finding out over and over again that he was lying to me and, cheating on me and all those things, that was very hurtful. But I wasn't willing to leave or let him go. After I finished my cancer treatments, within 3 months, I found out that I was pregnant with Derek's child. And at this point, we were not living together any longer because just all the mess with his drug use. We ended up losing our apartment, so we lived separately. I was excited because, again, I thought we were eventually going to get married and have a family. And he wasn't very excited. So he wasn't thinking the same as me at all at that point. He was really not wanting to be in a relationship anymore. It was really just about using me for money and sex. But he wasn't in a relationship with me. I just had an imaginary relationship at this point. So it was very heartbreaking. The response I got was that he would pay half of the abortion fees. And so that was devastating. I ended up taking him home because we were just hanging out. And I really didn't know what to do. I told my best friend at the time. And of course, she was scared. And neither of us we weren't saved. I hadn't even really been around the things of God at all my entire life. And so that wasn't really a thought that crossed my mind. And so what the next step was for me was I went and saw and told him. And he was devastated that I was considering having an abortion. He's the only one that tried to talk me out of it. But the front receptionist had heard me. It was actually his sister. And she had the same thing with her daughter. So she recommended a clinic I could go to. And I went and just made phone calls, got pricing, got it all figured out. It was like a whirlwind, just going through motions, because in my head, I thought that if I did this, that I could possibly still save the relationship and that I wouldn't have to go through rejection and loss. And I just remember the night before going to the clinic, or a couple of nights before, I did not ever pray. I had attended church a handful of times before having cancer, but I was sitting in my room and I was just crying and I was devastated. I was punching my stomach, hoping I would just miscarry. I didn't want to go and have an abortion. It really scared me. It wasn't about the baby. I was terrified of what that was going to be like. But I felt very lost and there was no turning back and I had no options. I was staying with my aunt at the time, and so she was aware she was going to take me to the clinic. Again, no one else besides my doctor had said anything. I kind of used to make myself feel better that I had just had chemo and radiation and that there'd be a slight chance there might be something wrong with my baby. But that's not what the doctor said. But that's still what I kind of clung to. And the day of the clinic, I remember on the ride there, I was extremely terrified. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't ever think of abortion before. I didn't know anyone who had one. And so we get there and there were a few people outside. I knew that they were Christian, but I didn't really pay attention to what they were saying. I can't remember, but I'm sure I was high at the time because I still was smoking weed. But I had noticed one young girl that was out there. I was the only one walking up at the time, so I know she was talking directly to me, but I couldn't make eye contact with her. But she looked familiar, like I might have known her from school. And that was just, it made me feel crummy about myself because I felt like I was doing something ashamed, I should be ashamed of. But now I know there was purpose behind that. When I went into the clinic, it was packed, full of people. It was so awful. And we signed in and sat down. And I just remember sitting there with my aunt. I don't really know what her job was. She was kind of in a funky mood. It was kind of weird. But so I felt really by myself because there was no real support. And I remember listening to all the conversations of these other women and looking and seeing if I could relate to any of them. And there were so many women in there that were just talking like it was nothing. And they've been there multiple times and that they just didn't have any feelings about it. And
They were happy-go-lucky, and I didn't understand like why I didn't feel that way. And so whenever they called me in, they had me go back. I think it was about, I can't really remember exactly, but it was February of 2005. And I was about 8 weeks pregnant at the time. They showed me the heartbeat because, now I know like they have to do these certain things. I really didn't understand why the people were so like calloused there. It was such a weird, surreal feeling being in there. And very like cold and just like, it was super scary. I'd been in jail before and it kind of almost felt like that, or like you're going to surgery or something. It was so weird. But they showed me the heartbeat, and I asked if you could tell the gender, and they said no, because I really didn't know anything about the process of being pregnant. And that was that. And then the doctor came in, or the surgeon, I don't even know what their profession is exactly, but he came in and they told me they were going to put me out and that I'd wake up and it would be over. So I lay back, and I just remember like, I kept thinking like I could get up and leave if I wanted to, and I didn't have to do it. But in my head, the only thing I could think of was being so selfish and thinking like, no one will be there for me. My boyfriend, he wasn't even my boyfriend, but there's no way that he would want to be with me if I had this kid, and I didn't know what I would do as a single mom. And at this time I was only 19, and so it was just very overwhelming. I just thought, honestly, kind of like some of the stuff, a lot of things that I went through that were bad in life, like I had like a kind of a mantra that I would say to myself is like, nothing lasts forever. And I applied it to so many things. So I just literally told myself to like shut down and get through it. And so they performed the procedure, and I woke up and they like sit you in this other room. It was just so weird. It felt like a cattle drive or something, like a slaughterhouse. It was so weird. They just like move you through these rooms and like there's no privacy. It was just so weird. So I sat in this like, I guess, recovery room with other women too, and they just give you what you need to, because you're bleeding heavily and in pain. And so you sit in there for a little while, I guess, to make sure you're okay. And then they send you on your way. Afterwards, it just affected, I could tell like I was off. First, I was in extreme pain going home. Like I had a hard time sitting down, but it definitely, like I went through a little funk of like depression afterwards and still trying to process it. But with everything that I'd gone through that had been so traumatic, I would just shut it out. And I really didn't know how to tell my family. My sister was aware, but she had gone through a crazy thing around this time too, where she was having seizures and stuff. So she really didn't even remember, but just my best friend and my aunt knew. I was so embarrassed to tell anyone. Of course, my boyfriend and I didn't work out anyways. And I just moved on. And it wasn't until I became a Christian that I started thinking about it. I'd really, honestly, it's embarrassing to me that I didn't think much about this child at all. It didn't actually affect me much until I became pregnant with my daughter and realizing that I would have had a different, another kid. That was very hard. And to tell my husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, that I had an abortion was embarrassing. He wasn't saved either. He didn't really think much of it. But to me, it was like, I didn't want anyone to know, because as I got older and matured, and I just realized what life was and how sad it was to just throw away something like that. And of course, then I started meeting people that were like adopted and like all these other options that were available. And I just was blown away that I was so blinded because I wanted things to be a certain way. And so I would have done anything for it. The way God has redeemed that for me, because I gave my life to Christ in 2009, and I was a young mom. We weren't married at the time, my husband and I, but we started a family. And, I just carried these things around. The abuse, the drug use, all the shame, everything. I just still carried everything around. I had no healing, even though I've done many counselings. Like I
I could talk about all of the things I'd been through without shedding a tear because I had just overtalked them so many times. But when I got saved and I encountered the love of God, and like the love of a father was just blew my mind. I still didn't think about the abortion, which is sad to me, until much later when I started sharing my testimony about coming to Christ. And right after I'd gotten saved, my biological dad, who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, which is a whole nother thing, but I ended up being his power of attorney. I had not seen him since I was like very young. And God took me through healing with my dad. He was homeless at the time and was injured and then put in a hospital on a ventilator and stuff. And so he ended up like quadriplegic, and he was here in Texas. His family was in Ohio. So I was given the responsibility of overseeing that, which was really weird and hard. But I had just gotten saved, and I just asked God to help me. And I did. I came to love my dad with the love of Christ, which was so crazy. And I know it's only God, because I hated that man. But it brought a deep inner healing to me. And then my dad ended up passing away. I ended up backsliding, not because of that, but just my husband wasn't saved. And I left the things of God. But after I came back, 2014, I gave my life back to Christ and made my mind up that I would not leave again. And at that point is where he really started healing all the hurts, because I forgave my dad, but I had a lot of pain and unforgiveness for men, and then even for my husband, because he ended up with a drug addiction. And so we ended up getting married and serving God together, and it seemed like everything was great, and things started bubbling to the surface that God would help me and get me through, and that was perfect. And then I would share my testimony very often. I was extremely used to it, and I would mention having an abortion, but didn't really go into detail unless God led me to. Sometimes I would go more in depth with certain women, but it wasn't anything I'd paid that much attention to unless there were certain things that triggered it. Like, every February I would think, man, I would have had a kid this month, little things like that made me and I, of course, had already repented of it, but it was actually an evangelist that came to church that was preaching, and he said he felt the Lord wanted to bring anyone who carried the shame and unforgiveness for themselves about abortion. And so I went forward and got prayed for, and, I repented, which I had when I gotten saved, but specifically for healing. And then shortly after that, I was driving to church, and it was a really sunny day on a summer day in Texas. And I had my sunroof open and my kids were in the back, and we were just listening to some worship music. We were singing at the top of our lungs, and God spoke so clearly to me and told me that when I finish the race that I'll see my child. And that was just out of the blue. And so it was so sweet to me that God, it's like he knew that I had this like stuffed down hurt still. But it gave me closure, because it's like, even though, I carried around this heaviness and it was so deep, I had forgiven myself, but it still had an emptiness. And I needed to hear that from my God, my Father. And it just reassured me that I knew I had been forgiven, but that this child was okay, and that it was going to be okay. And it gave me a hope that if you are facing the same decision that I was facing at 19 and single, and even though you might be terrified and not know what to expect, that God gives such a grace for that. And I have seen others make different choices and be so blessed. And I have met children, which are, my age now, but met those that were planned abortions and seen the lives that they've lived. So every excuse that I could have thought of was irrelevant. And that the shame and this choice,
I mean, it can be covered by grace, but you can't undo it. And that is like one of the biggest things. It's a mistake that you can never undo. And it's so hard. So even though I'm forgiven and I forgive myself, it still is very difficult to think that a whole life was taken because of my fear and selfishness, and that you can't undo it. And so I just encourage you that there's so many resources. Don't feel alone, even if your family or immediate, support system or should be support system is not helping, that you can reach out. I mean, I wish I would have thought to go to like a local church. I mean, there's such obvious places, but things online, a quick Google search would help you find resources. But even like the Speak Life, these are so many things God's raising up to help these children have a chance. And that, anything you do going forward that gives this child a chance at life is better than the other option.